Former Alaska Senator Ted Stevens was among 5 people killed in a plane crash late last night in Senator Stevens' home state of Alaska. Here's what we know so far. The flight carrying Senator Stevens and 8 others took off at about 2 p.m. local time. It left a lodge and it was going toward a fishing camp, a salmon fishing camp. It crashed about 15 minutes after takeoff, about 17 miles north of a town called Dillingham in Alaska. Of the 9 people on board, 5 are confirmed dead, including Senator Stevens, his former chief of staff, Bill Phillips, the pilot of the plane, Terry Smith, and Dana and Corey Tyndall of Anchorage. Dana Tyndall worked for the Alaska telecommunications firm GCI, which owned both the plane that crashed and the fishing lodge from which it departed for this trip. When the plane did not arrive at its destination, volunteer pilots flew out over the flight path to investigate what might have happened. They found the plane's wreckage on a remote rocky mountainside sometime after 7 p.m. last night. Because of low visibility and poor weather conditions, it wasn't until about 12 hours later that the Alaska National Guard and the Coast Guard were able to reach the crash scene. Before the Coast Guard and the National Guard were able to arrive this morning, this is remarkable, there are reports that 5 volunteers hiked to the location last night to help the crash victims. We'll have more on that as we learn more about it. At this hour, we still do not know why the plane went down. We do know that the plane was flying below radar, below 4,000 feet, which means it was flying under visual flight rules without any direction from air traffic controllers. 32 years ago, Senator Ted Stevens survived another small plane crash in Alaska, a crash that killed his wife, Ann, and 4 other people. That was a Learjet that crash-landed at the Anchorage airport in December 1978. The airport was later renamed for Senator Stevens. 6 years before that crash, another high-profile Alaskan politician also died in an aviation accident. That was October 1972, when Democratic Congressman Nick Begich, whose son Mark is now the state's junior senator, was campaigning with the House Majority Leader Hale Boggs when their plane disappeared en route to Juneau. The plane was never found. 2 peaks in the area, 2 mountains that they are believed to have disappeared in, were renamed Mount Begich and Mount Boggs in honor of the 2 men killed on that flight. These multiple accidents involving prominent Alaskans are obviously an awful tragedy, but they are not necessarily a coincidence in the sense that in Alaska, travel by small plane is very, very, very common, much more common than it is anywhere else in the United States. There are 14 times as many airplanes per capita in Alaska as anywhere else in the country. 1 out of every 58 Alaskans is a registered pilot. That's because although the state is twice the size of Texas, it has just 5 highways in the whole state. And not one of them connects the eastern part of the state to the western part of the state. In a state that is 663,000 square miles, there are 2,000 miles of roads. According to the director of the Alaskan Aviation Museum, more than 70% of Alaskan communities are accessible only by plane. One of the many, 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 many federally funded projects that Ted Stevens secured for Alaska when he was senator was a federal subsidy program for air travel to dozens of remote locations in Alaska. Now, the plane that was carrying Senator Stevens when it crashed was a 1957 de Havilland DHC-3 Otter. When outfitted with floats, an Otter can land on the water. It's a single-engine prop plane. Now, as I mentioned before, this particular plane, the one that crashed, was owned by the telecommunications company GCI. In 2002, another of these same kind of planes, owned by this same telecommunications company, flipped over while landing on a lake. The pilot drowned and a passenger was hurt. Obviously, the coverage of this horrible crash is being dominated by obituaries for Senator Stevens and the others who died on board that plane. One of the most amazing things about this story, though, is that there were 4 people who survived the crash. They survived the crash, and they survived 15 hours waiting at the scene to be evacuated. They were flown aboard a Coast Guard C-130 at 10 a.m. this morning to Anchorage for medical attention. The survivors include Sean O'Keefe, the former NASA administrator and Navy secretary who had worked for Senator Stevens earlier in his career. The survivors also include Mr. O'Keefe's teenage son, Kevin. The other survivors are William Phillips, who was the son of Bill Phillips, the former Stevens chief of staff who died in the crash, and another former Stevens aide, now a man who is a lobbyist. His name is Jim Morehard. Joining us now is Jason Lamb, a reporter with KTUU in Anchorage, Alaska. Jason, thanks very much for joining us this evening. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Rachel.
What do we know about the condition this evening of the 4 survivors?
Well, that's something we really don't know a lot about at this hour. We do know there have been 4 survivors, as you said. 3 of them were taken on a C-130 jet, one of the C-130 plane. One of them was actually taken on a private air ambulance. All of them are in Anchorage at a hospital there right now. But as far as the conditions, we're still trying to get that information.
Do officials have any specific ideas about why this plane might have crashed? Also, whether it is a surprise that there were survivors based on what we know about the crash?
Well, we haven't been able to talk to any NTSB officials to comment on specifically what even their initial indications of the cause of the crash were. But what we do know is the weather conditions out here last night were very dangerous to be flying any aircraft around. The ceilings as low as 100 feet, visibility very limited. We talked to a pilot earlier here today who said he saw the conditions out here last night and he would not be flying.
Wow. Jason, what has been the reaction in Alaska to the news of the crash and specifically to Senator Stevens' death? Obviously, he's a figure who looms so large in Alaska political history.
Well, yes, that's true. And we've been hearing from elected officials and from just everyday Alaskans coming by, just very, as you can imagine, sad about the death. This is someone who people affectionately called Uncle Ted, someone who served in the U.S. Senate longer than any other Republican in Senate history. And just not even 2 years ago, got over his own legal troubles and the corruption probe up here in Alaska. I think today, no matter what side of the aisle you may fall on, this is certainly a very, very big loss to Alaska, not to mention the other 4 people who are on that plane.
Absolutely. Jason Lamb, reporter with KTUU in Anchorage. I know it's a very busy night of coverage for you all with this big story in Alaska. Thanks for taking time to join us this evening, Jason.
Thanks, Rachel.